Glorified be thy name, O Lord my God. I beseech thee by thy power that hath encompassed all created things, and by thy sovereignty that hath transcended the entire creation, and by thy word, which was hidden in thy wisdom, and whereby thou didst create thy heaven and the earth, both to enable us to be steadfast in our love for thee and in our obedience to thy pleasure, and to fix our gaze upon thy face and celebrate thy glory. Empower us then, O my God, to spread abroad thy signs among thy creatures, and to guard thy faith in thy realm. Thou hast ever existed independently of the mention of any of thy creatures, and wilt remain as thou hast been forever and ever. In thee I have placed my whole confidence. Unto thee I have turned my face, and to the cord of thy loving providence I have clung, and towards the shadow of thy mercy I have hastened. Cast me not as one disappointed out of thy door, O my God, and withhold not from me thy grace, for thee alone do I seek. No God is there beside thee, the ever-forgiving, the most bountiful.
Members of the Universal House of Justice, counselor members of the International Teaching Center, friends, and guests, on behalf of the Serving the Divine Plan program, we want to welcome all of you to this month's evening talk titled A Rectitude of Conduct. I feel honored to introduce our speaker tonight and to share with you some brief information about him. He was born in Jamaica, West Indies. He is a journalist by profession, receiving his master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. He also holds a doctorate, an honorary doctorate, from the National College of Education in Illinois. He was a member of the editorial boards of Mary Knoll Publications and World Order magazine, and served as assistant editor to Africa Report. He taught journalism and English at Howard University. His activity in professional and service organizations includes current membership in the U.S. Society of Professional Journalists and 15 years as a member of Rotary International in Wilmette, Illinois. In 1967, while serving on its National Teaching Committee, at the request of the U.S. National Spiritual Assembly, he established the National Youth Office. He was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly the following year and became its secretary, a post he held until his election to the Universal House of Justice in July 1982. He and his wife, Dr. Bahia Mitchell, have one very lovely daughter, Dr. Teresa Mitchell. Speaking to us now about a rectitude of conduct, please join me in welcoming member of the Universal House of Justice, Mr. Glenford Mitchell.
Friends, this is a very deep subject. I didn't realize it until I took on the assignment. I want to say to you that people at my age sometimes begin to become strange. So be kind to an old guy. In his will and testament, Abdul-Baha exhorts us to rectitude of conduct. The Will and Testament, as you know, is a statement of the covenant. Normally, when we think of the covenant, we concentrate on the question of successorship of the center of authority to which we must turn. But as you know, the covenant is far more expansive than that. When you read the Will and Testament and you read Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i-Ad, you find that there are all kinds of subjects covered in these documents. And all of these constitute, it seems to me, the contract that we have with Baha'u'llah, the covenant. The covenant, I think, is the code that guides our spiritual, social, and personal behavior. In a sense, this code comprises three categories. A code of fundamental belief, and that connects us, of course, to the center of authority. A code of personal conduct, and we'll talk about that in the course of this discussion. A code of governance. By code of fundamental belief, I think of those provisions of the covenant that relate us to the source and purpose of our being as Baha'is. Listen to what Abdul-Baha has to say. This is the foundation of the belief of the people of Baha. His Holiness, the Exalted One, the Bab, is the manifestation of unity and oneness of God and the forerunner of the ancient beauty. His Holiness, the Abha Beauty, is the supreme manifestation of God and the dayspring of his most divine essence. All others are servants unto him and do his bidding. Unto the most holy book everyone must turn, and all that is not expressly recorded therein must be referred to the universal house of justice. That which this body, whether unanimously or by a majority, doth carry, that is verily the truth and the purpose of God himself. So there you have it. Code of fundamental belief. That's what anchors us. That's what keeps us connected to the source of our being and keeps us also in the line of guidance that has been provided for us by Baha'u'llah's appointment. Now, on the matter of code of personal conduct, I see this as enabling us to relate to ourselves as individuals and relating to one another and to the collectivity of our fellow beings, to a community. And this evening's discussion will help us to see how these relationships operate. Then there is what I call the code of governance, which guides and legitimizes the means of social organization, reveals clues to a system of administration without which social order and collective progress are impossible to sustain. It's one thing to have the manifestation appear and give his book, but if he does not tell us how to govern ourselves, we are left largely to our own devices. And you see what has happened in the past. Now, Baha'u'llah didn't want things to go wrong with his arrangement, and so he left us precise instructions for a system. We understand this system to be the administrative order outlined by himself, one which we labor continually to develop. Shoghi Effendi describes it as a pattern for future society. It points to the ultimate prospect of a new world order, which will rise from the constructive processes occupying peoples both within and outside the Baha'i community. You have heard, of course, of the lesser peace and the most great peace and the processes involved in these two major objectives. Baha'u'llah speaks of his new world order as this wondrous system, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. Rather potent words. To be sure, such descriptions inspire us with hope, great hope, given the lamentable record of humanity's efforts at governing itself. Barbara Tuchman, a celebrated historian, made a telling point in her book, The March of Folly. This book contains narratives of the foolishness of leaders of the long past and gives us lessons that ought to be internalized. She says, a phenomenon noticeable throughout history, regardless of place or period, is the pursuit by governments of policies contrary to their own interests. Mankind, she goes on, it seems, makes poorer performance of government than of almost any other human activity. That's quite an indictment. Mankind, it seems, makes poorer performance of government than of almost any other human activity. Then she asks, why do holders of high office so often act contrary to the way reason points and enlightened self-interest suggests? Why does intelligent mental process seem to so often not to function? You might well ask these questions looking at the kind of news we're getting these days from practically every country we can think about. Fortunate for us and for humanity as a whole, Baha'u'llah has offered in his covenant the means of resolving such questions. Fundamental belief, personal conduct, governance. Considering these three elements together, and there may well be others I have not yet grasped, the covenant makes unity of the human race and peace of the world possible. Clearly, the covenant encompasses all aspects of human life on this planet. The Master makes this point in several statements. For instance, he says, today, the stirring power that exhibits itself throughout all regions is the power of the covenant, which, like unto the artery, beats and pulsates in the body of the world. Again, he says, the power of the covenant is as the heat of the sun, which quickens and promotes the development of all created things on earth. It's all-encompassing. It involves us, it works through us, it works around us. Integral, then, to the successful application of this divine code in all its dimensions is the principle of rectitude of conduct. And it is this principle that we are meant to explore this evening. I hope to make this exploration brief and understandable. I'd like to begin by definition of rectitude. I went to my Webster's Third International and found these connotations, these definitions. One is a quality or state of being straight. It comes from the Latin rectus, which means straight, right. Straightness, a straight line. Then another connotation is strict observance of standards of integrity and honesty. This has the idea of straightness to it. Yes? Adherence to high moral code. Intrepid virtue. Righteousness. And still another, correctness of judgment or procedure, especially in the field of intellectual or artistic activity. So there you have it. It means straightness, correctness, rightness, integrity, intrepid virtue. Baha'u'llah repeatedly directs our attention to rectitude of conduct as a requisite of spiritual and social life. We find in the Gleanings, for instance, this sentence from one of his tablets: amity and rectitude of conduct rather than dissension and mischief are the marks of true faith. Elsewhere he says, we enjoin upon them all. He's writing a tablet to friends in which he's greeting them. And he says, we enjoin upon them all to conduct themselves with trustworthiness and rectitude and to lead chaste and virtuous lives. And yet again, we send our greetings to the friends and exhort them to conduct themselves with rectitude, trustworthiness, piety, virtue, and loving kindness. With all those qualities in fine, that will serve to bring forth man's true station in the world of being. Rectitude of conduct. And finally he says, I have here, it behoveth ye all so to adorn your inner and outer beings, that robed in trustworthiness, girt with righteousness, and arrayed in truthfulness and rectitude, ye may become the means for the exaltation of the cause and the education of the human race. But it is the appearance of the phrase rectitude of conduct in the Will and Testament that awakened me to its resonance with the covenant. Listen to this. It is incumbent upon everyone to show the utmost love, rectitude of conduct, straightforwardness, and sincere kindliness unto all the peoples and kindreds of the world, be they friends or strangers. Indeed, for me, the Will and Testament unveils a treasure trove of thought on rectitude of conduct in its covenantal meaning and purpose. If I have dwelt on the covenant in my opening remarks, it is to state that the covenant is the only legitimate setting for the theme under the discussion, rectitude of conduct. The reason is immediately discernible. The qualities implied by rectitude of conduct are essential, integral to the operation of the covenant. Rectitude of conduct, you may say, is woven into the very fabric of the covenant. Exploring the principle broadens our appreciation of what is expected of our response to the covenant. Now, as can be seen in the reading of the Will and Testament, rectitude of conduct is embedded in a company of qualities, straightforwardness, truthfulness, and all of that. A company of qualities that is incumbent upon us as Baha'is to internalize and demonstrate in our relations with friend and foe alike. This term, this three-word phrase, rectitude of conduct, is nestled among words with related implications. And as you see the definition of the Guardian, you see that all of these are part of it. Trustworthiness, truthfulness, straightforwardness, virtue. Shoghi Effendi plucked it out, this term, out of this verbal cluster to show us the eminence of its characteristics and the pervasive reach of its application to a satisfactory way of life in this age. Rectitude of conduct permeates all that we do or should do to live the life and serve the cause. And it is, we find the Guardian's treatment of the this divine concept in The Advent of Divine Justice. I'm sure you're familiar with that title, that book. And it is this source of interpretation and amplification on which I will draw in pursuing the subject. Now, as you know, The Advent of Divine Justice was written in 1938. It carries the date 25 December 1938. This was a year and over after the launching of the first 7-year plan, which in fact was the first systematic response to the tablets of the Divine Plan, the Charter of Teaching. Shoghi Effendi, it seems to me, in this long letter that is published as a book, wanted to sort out the thinking of the North American believers to whom the letter was addressed about the real meaning and application of the tablets of the Divine Plan, which of course was the charter that drove them to this teaching exercise. Now, to get to the subject of rectitude of conduct, I don't want to speak too much about the Advent, otherwise I'll get lost and you won't be able to stop me. He, after describing the situation in the world, the conditions that prevailed at that time, showing where all the problems were in Asia, in Africa, everywhere else, in Europe. Remember that at this time, 1938, Christmas Day, that it was on the eve of the Second World War, and that you had the North Americans launched on a plan that would exercise them throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. The plan had 2 specific objectives. One, to open all states of the United States, all provinces of Canada, all of the countries of the Americas to the cause. The second was to complete the exterior ornamentation of the house of worship in Wilmette, which was being built. These were the 2 main things. Shoghi Effendi addressed himself to these and told the friends how to behave, how to act, what to do. Then at one point he said, "Great as is the importance of fashioning the outward instruments," meaning, of course, the administrative system, the outward instruments, and of perfecting the administrative agencies which they can utilize for the prosecution of their dual task under this 7-year plan, vital and urgent as are the campaigns which they are initiating, the schemes which they are raising for the efficient conduct of both the teaching and temple work, the imponderable, the spiritual factors which are bound up with their human and social relationships are no less urgent and vital and demand constant scrutiny continual self-examination and heart-searching on their part, lest their value be impaired or their vital necessity be obscured or forgotten. He goes on, of these spiritual requisites of success, which constitute the bedrock on which the security of all teaching plans, temple projects, and financial schemes must ultimately rest, the following stand out as preeminent and vital. Upon the extent to which these basic requirements are met, and the manner in which the believers fulfill them in their individual lives, administrative activities, and social relationships, must depend the measure of the manifold blessings which the all-bountiful possessor can vouchsafe to them all. Then he comes. These requirements are none other than a high sense of moral rectitude in their social and administrative activities, absolute chastity in their individual lives, and complete freedom from prejudice in their dealings. So these are the three. And we are focusing, of course, on the first one. He tells us of a rectitude of conduct, which he describes as an abiding sense of undeviating justice, unobscured by the demoralizing influences which a corrupt-ridden political life so strikingly manifests. Then we have a definition, or the beginning of one. This rectitude of conduct, with its implications of justice, equity, truthfulness, honesty, fair-mindedness, reliability, and trustworthiness, must distinguish every phase of the life of the Baha'i community. Here we have this cluster of words again that I pointed out to you earlier. Shoghi Effendi then, having said this, takes us on a tour of the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha that relate to these implications. And so we have pages of quotations, of excerpts from the writings of these two figures of our faith. Now, I picked out some of these to highlight these implications. Didn't want to read the book to you. Under justice, for instance, we find in Baha'u'llah's writings this statement: the light of men is justice. Quench it not with the contrary winds of oppression and tyranny. And again, that which traineth the world is justice, for it is upheld by two pillars, reward and punishment. These two pillars are the sources of life to the world. It goes on, justice and equity are two guardians for the protection of man. They have appeared arrayed in their mighty and sacred names to maintain the world in uprightness and protect the nations. And furthermore, about equity, he has this to say: observe equity in your judgment, ye men of understanding and heart. He that is unjust, listen to this, he that is unjust in his judgment is destitute of the characteristics that distinguish man's station. Justice. Remember what Baha'u'llah says about justice being the best beloved of all things in my sight in the hidden words? Look at this. We must strive to be just in our judgment, otherwise we are destitute of the characteristics that distinguish man's station. Now, of honesty, he has quite a lot to tell us, but I want to just narrow it down to two quotations and think of honesty in terms of not seizing other people's things and not being seduced by things that don't belong to you. Baha'u'llah says, if the whole world were to be converted into silver and gold, no man who can be said to have truly ascended into the heaven of faith and certitude would deign to regard it, much less to seize and keep it. So, in simple terms, we are not thieves. Then, this is the other one that really is pretty potent. He says, they who dwell within the tabernacle of God and are established upon the seats of everlasting glory will refuse, though they be dying of hunger, to stretch forth their hands and seize unlawfully the property of their neighbor, however vile and worthless he may be. So, you see how it is. This principle, it's very firm. He says, they who dwell within the tabernacle of God. Yes, I read that before. He speaks of truthfulness. I picked out something about truthfulness. He says, let truthfulness be and courtesy be your adorning. Suffer not yourselves to be deprived of the robe of forbearance and justice, that the sweet savors of holiness may be wafted from your hearts upon all created things. Of fair-mindedness, be fair to yourselves and to others, that the evidences of justice may be revealed through your deeds among our faithful servants. Be fair to yourself and to others. This, to me, resonates with the golden rule. You know? Do unto others as you have others do unto you. Be fair. Be fair to yourself. Be fair to others. Trustworthiness. He has a great deal to say about trustworthiness. But I'll just mention a few. The companions of God are in this day, he says, the lump that must leaven the peoples of the world. They must show forth such trustworthiness, such truthfulness and perseverance, such deeds and character, that all mankind may profit by their example. Trustworthiness. Here again he says, within the breath of such souls as are pure and sanctified, far-reaching potentialities that they exercise. Let me read this again. Within the breath of such souls as are pure and sanctified, are far-reaching potentialities that they exercise their influence upon all created things, are far-reaching potentialities. Now, when you think of this, just the concept of trustworthiness, if we could trust everybody, it would have an incredible impact on much of our lives. Now we can't go to the airport, pass through the airport without being checked. Just think of that. Think of what it does to the economy not to be able to trust. Think of what it does to people who are entrusted with money to take care of others. When they pocket this money themselves, what harm it does to others. Our newspapers these days are filled with reports about this kind of behavior. Government officials that don't handle money well, that stash this money in Swiss bank accounts. Just think of it. Just think of the honesty that would allow people not to rob your house. You could leave your doors unlocked. There are societies where some few places in the world, maybe one or two, where people still don't lock their doors at night. But could you take a chance of that here or anywhere else? Really? honestly. So you see how these principles are not just meant to amuse the manifestation that he can make laws. These are vital to existence. And if we practice them, we preserve society and we make it possible for society to progress. Now, the effect of the internalizing of such qualities and virtues is, of course, to transform our inner character, to make us a new people, to make us a new race, as Baha'u'llah wants us to be. He tells us, of course, that the very purpose of his coming is to transform character. Listen to this. He says, is not the object of every revelation to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind? A transformation that shall manifest itself both outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions? For if the character of mankind be not changed, the futility of God's universal manifestation would be apparent. In other words, Baha'u'llah's coming and suffering would be a waste of time. Exhorting us to righteousness, Baha'u'llah points out that a good character is the best mantle for men from God. He tells us of the astonishing effects of a righteous behavior. One righteous act, he has written, is endowed with a potency that can so elevate the dust as to cause it to pass beyond the heaven of heavens. It can tear every bond asunder, and hath the power to restore the force that hath spent itself and vanished. Now, this is something to think about. Maybe we can't perceive this with the naked eye, but in the spiritual realm, it works because he says so. So just think that each of us has the capacity, if we apply ourselves to these principles, to exert such influence. It is an amazing thing. Now, let me move on. In all the teaching plans the Baha'i world has undertaken since 1996, the Universal House of Justice has called attention to the importance of the roles of what it identifies as the three protagonists: the individual, institutions, the community. The application of rectitude of conduct is critical to the success of each of these. With regard to individuals, for instance, the Guardian says that this principle must be manifested in the following ways. He says it must be constantly reflected in our business dealings, in our domestic lives, how we behave at home in relation to our family and our friends, in all manner of employment, how we behave on the job. Are we just? Are we fair? Are we truthful? Are we honest? And in any service they may render their government or people, he says. So in service to our governments, we have to maintain this policy of rectitude of conduct in all its dimensions. Of course, the Will and Testament tells us, and Baha'u'llah's own covenant tells us, Book of Covenant, to be loyal to government, to kings. If we show no respect to the authorities, why should we expect them to show respect to our institutions? What will happen in the future when the faith becomes predominant in the world? Wouldn't we expect non-Baha'is to respect the Baha'i institutions? Well, be fair to ourselves, be fair to others. Here's the principle. And it's just decent that we should respect authority to begin with. Baha'u'llah tells us that we should respect authority and obey it, established authority. Now to go on with the individual. This principle must be reflected, as the Guardian says, in uncompromising adherence of all, whether young or old, to the laws and ordinances revealed by Baha'u'llah and to the principles laid down by Abdul Baha. Must be reflected in the attitude of every loyal believer towards, and this is very interesting, non-acceptance of political posts, non-identification with political parties, non-participation in political controversies, and non-membership in political organizations and ecclesiastical institutions. Now you may ask, what does this have to do with fair-mindedness, justice, equity, and all of that? Well, think a bit. What is our first principle, our pivotal principle? The oneness of humankind, right? If we believe that, how can we join a political party that divvies up a society, that puts us on one side of things, that has us poking our fingers at others? It's not just. It's not fair. It's not equitable. It's wrong. So we don't join parties. We don't identify ourselves with the business of political parties. We don't get tied up in their controversies. And here is another rule. Baha'u'llah tells us in the Kitab-i-Ad that contention and conflict are forbidden. How then can we get into the noise of the world, in the political hubbub of the world? We can't. We can't demonstrate, you see, that impartiality, which is an element of rectitude of conduct. We can't rise above the storm and demonstrate the efficacy of the principles we propound. Then again, how can we be members of ecclesiastical organizations? Is that sensible? We believe in Baha'u'llah. We believe in progressive revelation. We say that he is the latest manifestation. He's the Lord of the age. And we go and join the Baptist church. What are we doing? What kind of a statement is that? We join the Anglicans. We're Anglicans and Baha'is? What does that mean? Unless we're schizophrenic, I mean. Speaking yet to the individual, he says that this principle must be reflected in the impartiality, and here is something pretty interesting, in the impartiality of every defender of the faith against its enemies. You know what we think about enemies sometimes and how we get riled up about them. In his fair-mindedness, in recognizing any merits that enemy may possess. Justice, you see. And in his honesty in discharging any obligations he may have towards him. You know how it is in the world. You get on the wrong side of somebody, and if you owe him some money, you say, forget about it. He doesn't deserve it. Who is he? Is that just? Baha'u'llah says no. If you owe him, pay him. If he has good qualities, observe these. Whatever the situation is, if he has good points, you have contention with him, concede that he has good points. Remember, the Master tells us about a person having so many bad qualities and so many good ones. You look for the good ones and you give credit. No, you don't have to be foolish and allow people who are your enemies to beat you up. Get out of their ways, find a way to contain them, but we must still be fair and just to them. This is a very important principle, friends, a very important aspect of rectitude of conduct. Now, so far as the individual teacher is concerned, This principle must constitute, the Guardian tells us, the brightest ornament of the life, the pursuits, the exertions, and the utterances of every Baha'i teacher. Well, you see how it is. If we are truthful, we must tell the truth. We must live the truth. So all of these things relate to rectitude of conduct and the way that we are able to express ourselves in the kind of life that we live. Now, as to institutions, this principle, what the Guardian calls the principle of divine justice, he calls it, rectitude of conduct, must be exemplified in the conduct of all Baha'i electors when exercising their sacred rights and functions. Now, this is a huge subject, and I don't intend to get into it. One could talk about that as an evening's discussion in itself. But how does this work? Fair-mindedness, equity, truthfulness, honesty, all of these things. Well, let us say that you have to make a judgment about the people that are elected to institutions. How do you make this judgment? Do you judge solely on the basis of personal friendship? I like this guy, therefore I'll elect him? Or do you do this on the basis of a judgment that says this person has the characteristics, has the experience, the training to do the job? Even if you don't like his personality, what difference does it make? You have to make a judgment as to the qualities that are required for office and act accordingly. So here is one sense in which I think the principle applies. Again, speaking of institutions more particularly, this is now an individual act, but it's related to institutions. That's why I put it under the category of institutions, but it really has to do with the individual. This election business, I mean. It must manifest itself with ever-increasing potency, the Guardian tells us, in every verdict which the elected representatives of the Baha'i community may be called upon to pronounce. Again, honesty, fair-mindedness, justice. You go to the institutions for justice. And those who constitute the institution, those individuals, now must take into their consultations these very principles that motivate their lives in or out of the institution. He says it must be the hallmark of the National Spiritual Assembly of every country. After all, they elect the Universal House of Justice. We don't want a wobbly House of Justice up here because people are not making proper judgments and not behaving properly. Must be regarded as the crowning distinction of all local and national spiritual assemblies. Now, in this particular section of the Advent, where the Guardian is discussing this as it applies to institutions, he calls our attention to the primacy of this principle of divine justice. He tells us that Baha'u'llah himself subordinates his personal inclination and wish to the all-compelling force of its demands and implications. The manifestation of God himself, who is delivering these kinds of laws to us, obeys them, abides by them. Here is something that Baha'u'llah has to say in that respect. God is my witness. Were it not contrary to the law of God, I would have kissed the hand of my would-be murderer and would cause him to inherit my earthly goods. I am restrained, however, by the binding law laid down in the book. So if the manifestation of God can obey the law, can't we try to do the same? It's very important. Now, thirdly, we see this in regard to the community. And I take a more general view of this. I won't get into. With regard to the community, the effects of the principle of rectitude and conduct in the individuals and institutions that compose it endow it with the character of a dynamic social entity, a civilizing force, indeed as a magnificent unit of civilization. You think of a society, of a group of people, of a community, a village, a city, made up of people that are adhering to these principles. Wouldn't this be paradise on earth? A progressive community results from the aggregate of the efforts of conscientious individuals to observe this standard of divine justice. The community also thrives on the ministrations of justice provided by its institutions, whose members are imbued with that standard. This is critical business for us. So you see how it works. You have the institutions that are bound by these principles, but the individual is equally bound. And to the extent that the individual participates in the workings of the institution, there is a guarantee that the principle will motivate the decisions that are made. This is extremely important. The individual here is extremely important. And I make a point of this, that it is on the conduct of the individual that the success of both the institutions and the community depends. So each of us is critical to the expression, the manifestation, the realization of these qualities on the planet. Each of us is responsible. It's no wonder that Baha'u'llah wants us to be conscious all the time. That's why he doesn't want us to take drugs or drink alcohol, because we shouldn't lose the ability to think all the time and to be balanced about our business. See, all these things are related. Now, about the individual and the key role that the individual plays in all of this. And what I have said here, that it is on the conduct of the individual that the success of both the institutions and the community depends, this conclusion can be deduced from Shoghi Effendi's comments on the role of the individual in relation to a teaching plan. And I go back to the 10-year plan, to a letter that he wrote, where he described the elements of the plan, pointed out the things that were vital for the Friends to focus on, and then he said this challenge, so severe and insistent, and yet so glorious, faces no doubt primarily the individual believer, on whom, in the last resort, depends the fate of the entire community. So you thought you were an ordinary Joe. You're not. You have responsibilities. I have responsibilities. You don't have to be on an institution to have such responsibilities. You always have it, regardless of your situation in life. He it is, that's the individual, who constitutes the warp and woof on which the quality and pattern of the whole fabric must depend. He it is who acts as one of the countless links in the mighty chain that now girdles the globe. He it is who serves as one of the multitude of bricks which support the structure and ensure the stability of the administrative edifice now being raised in every part of the world. Then listen to the consequences of not delivering the goods. Listen to this. Without his support, at once wholehearted, continuous, and generous, every measure adopted and every plan formulated by the national representatives of the community to which he belongs is foredoomed to failure. And he has other things to say that I won't read. It will shake up your liver too much. Now, when the Guardian discussed all of this, rectitude of conduct, along with this other principles, chaste and holy life, freedom from prejudice, he then emphasized the importance of adopting what he called the prerequisites of success as the weapons, he said, of a double crusade. Double crusade. What's this? First, he says, to regenerate the inward life of their own community, and next, to assail the long-standing evils that have entrenched themselves in the life of their nation. In other words, we internalize this, we learn it, we act upon it, and by acting upon it, we assail the evils of the society about us. And this is what we are about, friends. All these plans that we talk about, 5-year plan, 4-year plan, 1-year plan, whatever it is, that's the business we are in. Inner transformation, external transformation. Change the things around us by the way we live, the way we behave. And society depends upon us to make the change, to go through the processes of transformation that will lead it to the golden age. We are responsible. Each of us is responsible. So speaking about this twofold crusade, the Guardian says that we must of necessity encounter stiff resistance and suffer many a setback. In other words, if you behave yourself, people are not going to like it. If you start exuding these principles in your behavior, they might get upset with you. What are you talking about? Fairness. Don't cheat me. Don't cheat other people, and so on. Their faith, he says, they may soon find has been assaulted, their motives misconstrued, their aims defamed, their aspirations derided. Of course, when you tie this together with freedom from prejudice and chastity and holiness, you get the full weight of the point he's making. But he says, never mind. The invincible army of Baha'u'llah should not be deterred, not recoil before the threatening advance of the forces of fanaticism, of orthodoxy, of corruption, and of prejudice that may be leagued against it. Then he tells us something fascinating. He says the voice of criticism is a voice that indirectly reinforces the proclamation of its cause. Here again, we're dealing in paradoxes. He says, unpopularity but serves to throw into greater relief the contrast between it, that's a community, and its adversaries. Now, if you want to read a scary sentence for an American, it's unpopularity. They don't like unpopularity. The Guardian says it serves to throw into greater relief the contrast between it and its adversaries. While, and he uses a bigger term, ostracism is itself the magnetic power that must eventually win over to its camp the most vociferous and inveterate of its foes. Now just think about that. It's happened in Iran. Talk to your Iranian brothers and sisters. They'll tell you who people were ready to saw their heads off, change their minds, and they became part of the community. Yeah. The contrast was clear. They could see the difference, and they were magnetized by it. That's what we are called upon to do. And this standard of living is required if we're going to have any effect whatsoever on the progress of humanity. It's not enough to recite the objectives of the plans that we have. Yes, we are now in the business of doing what? Advancing the process of entry by troops. How are we going to do that if we're not behaving like this? We talk, people won't get anything from it. It has no meaning. They can't feel the juice that's coming through you. The spiritual juice has to flow because you're behaving properly. Now, so I leave you with that so far as rectitude of conduct is concerned. And I want to make a bit of a comment about something else that's related to it. You know, and to bring me back to the covenant, which is the umbrella over all of this. There is such a concept in political thought as social contract. It's not a precise term, it's hard to define, but when I looked it up in my political dictionary, it says a contract between persons in a pre-political or pre-social condition, specifying the terms upon which they are prepared to enter society or submit to political authority. Can you imagine a time when humanity was at a stage of pre-political, pre-whatever, living out there in the wild, and now there's to be a social contract to tell them how to relate to a different form of living, how to relate to governance and so on. For many authors, we are told the social contract explained or illuminated a transition from a state of nature to a social or political existence. Now, we had some wonderful thinkers who were looking through this. This thought has been around since Plato's time and occupied a lot of discussion in the 11th and 12th and 13th century and so on, and took on quite a bit of steam in the 18th and 19th century with people like John Locke, David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If you read their books, their treatises, you will see it also, all of this discussion of these men in that period also fed the intellectual vials of the founders of the American nation. So, a great variety of social contract theories have been propounded, and despite the skepticism of authors like Hume, the contract tradition is still important in political theory. It's good to think about it. And the whole idea is, how do we operate in a society that is organized? How do we organize ourselves to function as a nation or as a community, a society? These are the thoughts that we're having. They were good thoughts, and they're very interesting notions that they had about this. But the point I want to make in bringing this up is this: that humanity has been struggling to cope with its own existence as a corporate entity, and has found it very difficult to come up with the answers that are clear, that are coherent, and that are totally effective. Then comes Baha'u'llah, and he gives us the covenant. The covenant has resolved all these issues, just like that. Isn't it a blessing, friends? We don't have to worry about these things, how this relates to that and why it should do this. We have the principles, the system, the framework, the institutions, and we have continuing guidance until the appearance of the next manifestation of God. See how lucky we are. This rectitude of conduct thing is quite extraordinary in helping us to work our way through to that glory time. So let me make a few summarizing remarks about rectitude of conduct. Rectitude of conduct implies, it seems to me, individual responsibility for maintenance of justice, a responsibility that expresses itself in relation to oneself, to others, and to the institutions charged with the administration of justice. Rectitude of conduct introduces us to a manner of living that guarantees the maintenance of a moral and just society. Morality, as you know, as it makes clear anyhow, is an essential virtue of the maintenance of justice and in weaving the fabric of a just, well-adjusted society. All of this, as you know, begins, as all essential qualities of good society, with the individual. And that's the point I want to leave with you. The individual is responsible, must be alert and constantly thinking about this and acting upon it. Rectitude of conduct implies an individual responsibility that is indispensable to the making and maintenance of any community, any society. It enables us to construct a virtuous society that exudes a spirit of justice at both the individual and collective level. Rectitude of conduct in the individual is indeed matured, developed through fear of God. And when I say fear of God, I don't mean that you're scared to die. I mean it in the sense of the awareness of the presence of God in us and the desire to please Him. So, Baha'u'llah tells us something that I will close with. It's an appeal. He says, "O friends, be not careless of the virtues with which ye have been endowed, neither be neglectful of your high destiny. Ye are the stars of the heaven of understanding, the breeze that stirreth at the break of day, the soft flowing waters upon which must depend the very life of all men." And one more thought. You remember in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, I think it's the Kitab-i-Aqdas, Baha'u'llah tells us about that first day of Rizwan in Baghdad. And what happened there? Two things he told us happened of global significance. One, he said, is that humanity was submerged in the sea of purification. The other, he said, was that what was the term he used? But the breezes of forgiveness were wafted over the entire creation. I take this to mean that he drew a line between then and now. And now he's endowed us with the capacity to fulfill every wish, every quality he has assigned to us.